For more than 20 years, millions of men around the world have turned to a seemingly simple solution for a common problem: hair loss. The prescription medication finasteride promised to restore not just hair, but confidence and youthfulness. Marketed as a low-risk intervention for male pattern baldness, the drug became a staple recommendation in dermatology clinics and a frequent topic in online forums where men shared their hopes for regrowth and renewed self-image. Yet behind this veneer of cosmetic enhancement, a darker narrative has been unfolding. Accumulating reports of severe depression, crippling anxiety, and even suicide have cast an increasingly ominous shadow over finasteride's reputation. Now, a comprehensive analysis by Professor Meir Breizes from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem suggests that the medical establishment and regulatory authorities may have failed in their fundamental duty to protect public health, repeatedly dismissing or downplaying evidence of the drug's potentially catastrophic psychiatric consequences. A pattern emerges from global data. Professor Breizes' investigation, which appears in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, represents a systematic examination of 8 major research studies conducted between 2017 and 2023. The scope of this analysis is remarkable in its breadth, drawing from diverse data sources across multiple continents and healthcare systems. The research encompasses information from the United States Food and Drug Administration's Adverse Event Reporting System, national health registries in Sweden, comprehensive medical databases in Canada, and healthcare records from Israel. What emerges from this multinational data synthesis is not a collection of isolated incidents or coincidental correlations, but rather a persistent and troubling pattern. Across different populations, healthcare systems, and study methodologies, the evidence points in the same direction. Individuals using finasteride face substantially elevated risks of developing mood disorders and experiencing suicidal ideation compared to similar patients who do not take the medication. Professor Breizes, who holds the position of Professor Emeritus in both medicine and public health, emphasizes the significance of this consistency. The days of dismissing concerns about finasteride's psychiatric effects as merely anecdotal or based on unreliable patient reports have passed. The evidence base has evolved into something far more substantial and scientifically rigorous, revealing patterns that persist across diverse populations and research approaches. The human toll suggested by this accumulated evidence is staggering and deeply troubling. According to the analysis, hundreds of thousands of individuals may have experienced depression directly attributable to their use of finasteride. Even more devastating, the data suggests that hundreds of people, and quite possibly many more, may have died by suicide as a consequence of taking this medication. The drug's journey to market dominance. To understand the magnitude of this potential public health failure, it helps to examine finasteride's path to widespread use. The medication received approval from the FDA in 1997 specifically for treating male pattern baldness, a condition that, while psychologically significant for many men, represents a cosmetic rather than medical concern. The drug had previously been approved at higher doses for treating benign prostatic hyperplasia, an enlargement of the prostate gland that can cause urinary difficulties in older men. For hair loss treatment, finasteride found a ready market among men, often quite young, who were distressed by thinning hair and receding hairlines. Marketing efforts, including direct-to-consumer advertising, positioned the medication as a straightforward solution with minimal downside risk. The promise was appealing. Take a daily pill and potentially halt or even reverse hair loss, with the primary known side effects being related to sexual function in a relatively small percentage of users. Over the years, finasteride became deeply embedded in the standard approach to treating male hair loss. Dermatologists regularly prescribed it, and it became a fixture in discussions about hair restoration options. The drug's cosmetic application meant it was being recommended to otherwise healthy young men, individuals with their entire lives ahead of them, for a condition that posed no threat to their physical health. Warning signs ignored and suppressed. The troubling aspect of this story is not simply that psychiatric side effects emerged, but rather that warning signals appeared early and were systematically overlooked or minimized. Researchers began raising concerns about potential psychiatric effects as far back as 2002, yet these early warnings failed to trigger the kind of intensive investigation that such signals should have prompted. The FDA's response timeline reveals a pattern of delayed and inadequate action. It was not until 2011, a full 14 years after the drug's approval for hair loss and 9 years after initial concerns were raised, that the agency officially acknowledged depression as a potential adverse effect of finasteride. Even more remarkably, it took until 2022 for the FDA to add information about suicidality to the drug's labeling, a full 25 years after approval and 2 decades after researchers first flagged potential problems. Perhaps most disturbing are revelations from internal FDA documents dating to 2010, which Professor Brezies references in his analysis. These documents contain substantial portions that have been redacted and marked as confidential commercial information. Among the blacked-out text are estimates concerning how many users might have been affected by psychiatric adverse effects. This suppression of potentially critical public health information in the name of protecting proprietary business interests raises profound questions about regulatory priorities and the balance between commercial considerations and patient safety. The underreporting of adverse events presents another dimension of the problem. By 2011, the FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System had recorded merely 18 suicides associated with finasteride use. However, when researchers attempted to calculate what the expected number should be based on global usage patterns and known baseline suicide rates, the figure should have been in the thousands. This vast discrepancy points not to the absence of a problem, but rather to a fundamental breakdown in the pharmacovigilance system, the network of monitoring and reporting mechanisms designed to detect drug safety issues after medications reach the market. The cosmetic classification problem. Professor Brezies argues persuasively that finasteride's classification as a cosmetic medication may have inadvertently shielded it from the level of scrutiny that would typically be applied to drugs treating serious medical conditions. Medications prescribed for life-threatening diseases or severe chronic conditions typically face intensive ongoing monitoring, with regulatory agencies and manufacturers maintaining vigilant surveillance for adverse effects. The risk-benefit calculation for such medications naturally differs from that of a drug prescribed purely to improve appearance. In the case of finasteride for hair loss, the medical necessity is essentially absent. As Brezies pointedly observes, this intervention was not about preserving life or preventing serious illness. The decision to take finasteride was fundamentally about hair, about appearance, about cosmetic concerns. When the intervention is elective and the condition being treated poses no health threat, even relatively modest risks take on different significance. A side effect profile that might be acceptable for a medication treating a potentially fatal disease becomes much harder to justify for a cosmetic treatment. This raises uncomfortable questions about informed consent and how risks are communicated to patients. Were young men considering finasteride for hair loss adequately informed about potential psychiatric risks? Were they given sufficient information to make truly informed decisions about whether the cosmetic benefits justified the potential for serious mental health consequences? The evidence suggests that for many years, the answer to these questions was almost certainly no understanding the biological mechanisms. The biological rationale for finasteride's psychiatric effects is becoming increasingly clear through ongoing research. The drug functions by inhibiting an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase, which is responsible for converting testosterone into a more potent androgen called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. In the scalp, DHT contributes to the miniaturization of hair follicles that characterizes male pattern baldness, so blocking its formation can slow or prevent this process. However, the 5-alpha reductase enzyme does not operate exclusively in the scalp. It plays important roles throughout the body, including in the brain, where it is involved in the synthesis of neurosteroids. These are steroid hormones that are produced within the nervous system and play crucial roles in regulating mood, stress responses, and overall brain function. One particularly important neurosteroid affected by finasteride is allopregnanolone, a compound that has been closely linked to mood regulation and has even been developed as a treatment for postpartum depression. By blocking 5-alpha reductase, finasteride may disrupt the brain's production of these mood-regulating neurosteroids, potentially triggering or exacerbating depression and anxiety in susceptible individuals. Animal studies have provided additional concerning evidence, demonstrating that finasteride exposure can lead to persistent neuroinflammation, alterations in brain chemistry, and even structural changes in the hippocampus, a brain region critical for memory and emotional regulation. What makes these findings particularly alarming is their durability. Some animal studies have shown that these neurological changes can persist long after finasteride exposure has ended, suggesting the possibility of lasting impact on brain function. The specter of post-finasteride syndrome for some patients, the nightmare does not end when they stop taking finasteride. A constellation of symptoms that has come to be known as post-finasteride syndrome has been reported by numerous former users, who describe persistent problems that continue for months or even years after discontinuing the medication. These lingering effects include severe insomnia that resists conventional treatment, panic attacks that seem to emerge without clear triggers, cognitive dysfunction affecting memory and concentration, and ongoing suicidal thoughts that represent a constant struggle. The existence and nature of post-finasteride syndrome remains somewhat controversial in medical circles, with debates about its prevalence, mechanisms, and even validity as a distinct clinical entity. However, the consistency of patient reports and the growing body of research into finasteride's neurological effects lend credibility to these accounts. If even a small percentage of the millions of finasteride users develop persistent psychiatric symptoms, the public health implications are substantial. Corporate responsibility and regulatory failure. Professor Brezis's analysis is particularly critical of both the pharmaceutical industry and regulatory authorities, arguing that both parties failed in their responsibilities to protect public health. Despite having access to vast databases of patient information and sophisticated tools for detecting safety signals, neither the drug's manufacturer nor the FDA took timely action to investigate and address the emerging evidence of psychiatric risks. The original manufacturer, Merck, and subsequently Organon, which now markets the drug, conducted none of the major data mining studies that ultimately revealed the psychiatric risk signal. This absence of manufacturer-initiated safety research is striking, particularly given that such companies have both the resources and the ethical obligation to monitor their products' safety profiles. Professor Brezis suggests that this silence may have been strategic, driven by concerns about market impact and legal liability, a pattern that echoes previous pharmaceutical controversies, including Merck's troubled handling of the pain medication Vioxx, which was withdrawn from the market after being linked to increased cardiovascular risks. When confronted with these concerns, Organon has issued statements emphasizing that nothing is more important to the company than the safety of its medications. However, such assurances ring hollow in the absence of concrete action. The fact that all of the significant safety research identifying finasteride psychiatric risks was conducted by independent researchers rather than being initiated by the manufacturer raises serious questions about the adequacy of pharmaceutical industry self-monitoring. The FDA's performance has been equally disappointing. When concerned scientists and patient advocates submitted a citizen petition requesting that the agency add a black box warning, the most serious type of safety alert, to finasteride's labeling, the response was glacially slow. It took the FDA 5 years to issue a decision on this petition. When the decision finally came, the agency agreed to add information about suicidal ideation to the drug's label, but stopped short of implementing a formal black box warning that would have drawn more attention to the risk. A call for systemic reform. In response to these failures, Professor Brezies has outlined a series of recommendations aimed at preventing similar public health disasters in the future. His proposals represent a comprehensive rethinking of how drugs prescribed for cosmetic or non-essential purposes should be regulated, monitored, and prescribed. First among these recommendations is a call to suspend the marketing and prescription of finasteride for cosmetic purposes until its safety can be definitively re-established through rigorous, independent research. This suggestion recognizes that when a medication serves a purely cosmetic function, the threshold for acceptable risk must be considerably lower than for drugs treating serious diseases. Brezies also advocates for mandatory post-approval safety studies with strict enforcement mechanisms and meaningful consequences for non-compliance. The current system relies too heavily on voluntary reporting and manufacturer initiative, which has proven inadequate. Regulatory requirements need teeth, with real penalties for companies that fail to conduct required safety monitoring. Another recommendation involves systematic changes to how suicide cases are investigated and documented. Brezies proposes that complete medication histories should be routinely recorded and analyzed in all suicide investigations, creating a data infrastructure that would make it easier to detect signals linking particular drugs to increased suicide risk. These proposals represent more than technical adjustments to regulatory procedures. They embody a fundamental principle that patient safety must take precedence over commercial interests, and that this principle should be reflected in concrete policies and enforcement mechanisms. A dedication to those lost. Professor Brezies' paper carries a dedication that transforms abstract statistics into human tragedy. It is dedicated to a specific individual, a man who was healthy and thriving before he made the decision to take finasteride to address his hair loss concerns. Within days of beginning the medication, this man descended into severe psychiatric distress. Despite discontinuing the drug and seeking treatment, he never recovered his previous mental health. Months after this ordeal began, consumed by despair that may have been triggered by a medication he took for purely cosmetic reasons, he ended his own life. This dedication serves as a powerful reminder that behind every adverse event report, every statistic, every data point in the research literature, there are real people and devastated families. For the loved ones of those who have suffered or died, regulatory reforms and enhanced monitoring systems come too late to undo the damage. Yet their experiences can and should drive changes that protect future patients from similar fates. The story of finasteride and its hidden psychiatric risks represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate drug safety monitoring, the conflicts between commercial interests and public health, and the particular vulnerabilities created when powerful medications are prescribed for non-essential, cosmetic purposes. As this evidence continues to accumulate and the scope of the problem becomes impossible to ignore, the question remains: how many more warnings will be needed before meaningful action is taken to protect patients from preventable harm?